So this is the fifth straight provincial election to deliver a right-leaning party. Is Canada becoming conservative country overall? Let's discuss this with our panel. In Ottawa, writer with iPolitics, Katie O'Malley. In Ottawa, Globe and Mail columnist John Ibbitson. And here in Toronto, social media editor at BuzzFeed News, Elamine Abdelmahmoud. Elamine, I'll start with you because I haven't seen you in so long.
Yeah.
Is Canada becoming a conservative country? Are we a conservative country?
I mean, look, we are a country that has a history of sort of flipping the order so that when we have one party in power federally, a lot of provinces tend to go the other way. That is the one thing that we've seen sort of historically across this country. We can't really say that a PEI conservative is the same as an Alberta conservative. So in that
sense, we just heard, yeah.
Exactly. And in that sense, it's real hard to sort of pin down the idea that there's a uniform conservative wave across the country.
Okay, John, what do you think?
I think there is a wave of opposition to incumbent governments across the country.
Yes.
A lot of those incumbent governments were Liberal. So if conservatives are looking at these numbers and these results, they should be feeling good. There is concerted opposition to the carbon tax among provincial governments from Alberta through to New Brunswick. There is a general feeling, it seems, in the land that the bums need to be thrown out. And most of those bums were Liberals up until very recently. So if you were to translate to the federal level, you would say, well, all right, on the one hand, maybe this looks good for us, you know, for conservatives in the provinces and then Liberals in Ottawa. But on the other hand, I think if I were a Liberal looking at this, I would say, I don't like this tendency of voters to toss out whoever is the incumbent government of the day.
Okay, we'll talk more about why that is, the issues that might be surrounding that. But Katie, I want you to weigh in. What do you think is happening here? And give us your opinion on what happened in what appears to be another conservative win in PEI.
Well, I have to say that, and again, I hate to agree with both of my other panelists, but I really don't see this as part of a trend. I think as journalists, political journalists, we are so tempted constantly to try to see narratives and themes and trend lines and turn it all into one big story that always ends in a federal election that reflects the provinces. Very rarely does it actually turn out that way, and I think it's kind of dangerous for us to assume that when we're going into it. That said, I actually would suggest the most interesting to me and noteworthy aspect of last night's election on Prince Edward Island was actually the momentum shown by the Greens. Now, they didn't manage to seal the deal. They didn't elect enough seats. They didn't fill enough seats to win government or to try to form a government minority, but they more than doubled their seat count. They're now the official opposition. It's part of a trend that I suspect is making Elizabeth May and the federal Greens very happy. And what it does suggest, and I heard another analyst saying this earlier today, is Canadians do seem to be now more willing to embrace non-traditional parties. And the Green Party is one that can really take advantage of that. If I were the federal Liberals, what I would be worrying about isn't so much the notion that there's a conservative wave, but that there are more options for people on the center left, which could lead to vote splitting, which could make for a much more volatile dynamic in terms of when people go to the polls.
Yeah. What's making people so unhappy, John?
Yeah, and I do want to say with respect, I disagree with Katie. I think there is a wave, there is a trend. It's a trend to defeat incumbent governments who just happened, it would seem, to be in many cases Liberal, but also in some cases NDP. There is, I think, has been a general sense of discontent since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, a feeling that things have never really, the ship has never really righted itself. That even though the unemployment levels are low, jobs are precarious, they don't have permanence, it seems impossible for younger people to be able to accumulate the savings they need to buy a house. The economy is contingent, defined benefit plans are a thing of the past. So there's a restlessness in the middle class, and various politicians have come to power saying, I understand your pain and I have ways to fix it. They don't. And then people decide, well, then I'll try someone else. There is one other thing, though, that we have to look at, and that is that carbon tax. Because while the Greens made some significant progress in Prince Edward Island, you do have premiers from Edmonton all the way to Fredericton saying that we are adamantly opposed to the Liberal carbon tax and we will campaign against it in the next election. So there is a true split over climate change on the one hand, but I hate carbon taxes on the other. And that is something that's going to play out very prominently, I think, in federal politics over the next 6 months.
Okay, go ahead, Elami.
Well, I just wanted to give a little bit of a context to the trend that John is pointing out here. So, like, we used to be pretty familiar with the idea that governments, like provincial governments, tend to win second mandates, but that has not really been happening for some time in this country. So, for example, you saw that Quebec has been governed by 3 different parties just in the last, I think, like 8 or 9 years. So we are definitely in a state of restlessness, and I think that's felt across the country, and that's the part that doesn't bode that well for the Liberals. And
what do you think, Elamine, is causing that restlessness, that impatience to not even wait out another term? Well, I mean, for one thing, you know, you hate to point down south, but like there is a change in the discourse about how we talk about politics in this country and in the U.S. And I think some of that has seeped into our politics. Our politics have become much more charged, I think, just in the last 3 or 4 years than they have been before. We saw just like the nastiness of these recent elections, especially Alberta one, has been sort of like marked for a lot of people. Like we don't really see a lot of nice politics around anymore. Okay, Katie, do you want to weigh in on what you think is making people so upset?
I have kind of a different theory. It's not so much that I think people are more upset than they are in the general cycle of up and down. I mean, governments ultimately are always going to be defeated. So there's always eventually going to be, you know, an end to an incumbency. But I do wonder if the politically charged environment and also just the speed and the pace of news, of politics, and discussion is just causing all this to happen at kind of an accelerated rate. In other words, where it would have taken maybe 2 or even 3 mandates to get fully sick of a government in power, now they get 1 if they're lucky. So I think that might be playing into it as well. It isn't so much that people are more upset now than they would have been in the past. It's just that they're more willing to kind of take action, and everything just happens faster. Okay, I want to pick up on the comments about, and John, I think you made them about carbon tax. You're setting the terms for this panel tonight, John. Well done. But let me start here. What is, and this is something you said, Elamine, what is the difference between a conservative in Alberta and a conservative in PEI? What is that fundamental difference? Anybody want to take that on?
Well, I think it is absolutely true that in the Maritimes in general, there is less political polarization, always has been. Traditionally, whether the Liberals, well, let's put it this way, whether the Grits or the Tories got in, and they're dependent on patronage as much as anything else. That's not the case now, of course. But you don't see the sharp divisions that you see, for example, in Alberta or British Columbia between political parties, or now in Ontario between political parties. That just doesn't exist in PEI. But we do have Mr. Higgs in New Brunswick, and he has joined the anti-carbon tax fight. And so to that extent, you have a progressive conservative in New Brunswick who's every bit as anti-carbon tax as the conservative leaders in Ontario and Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So there is that common front, and it does include one of the maritime provinces.
Yeah. Katie?
What I'm going to be really interested to see is I'm trying to cast my mind back and trying to remember any time where a provincial government's view of what the federal government was doing on a particular policy had any noticeable, perceivable impact on the way the electorate behaved. Because I know this is true in Ontario, and I suspect it's definitely can be the case in other provinces as well. Voters are perfectly capable of, you know, having a completely bilateral approach. They look at the provincial government, they might cheerfully vote for Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives, and then on the other hand, they are going to vote for federal Liberals or federal New Democrats. They seem to be very able to hold those seemingly contradictory positions in terms of who they're going to elect at a provincial and federal level. And because of that, I definitely think the debate over the carbon tax is going to be a central feature. I'm really skeptical that the views of the provinces are going to have a significant influence over undecided voters. I think that, you know, conservative and liberal partisans across the land are going to rally behind their federal representatives, whether they're at provincial level or any other. But I'm not sure that the great undecided, the majority, frankly, of voters are going to be terribly pressured one way or another based on what they hear from their premier.
We'll see what happens, but I look at especially the Ontario and the Alberta governments right now as giant super PACs, like their American equivalents. They have vast sums of money, and they are going to spend it on advertising, trying to demonize the Liberals as tax and spenders. I don't know how that looks good for the Liberals, or how it could not have any impact whatsoever on the election campaign.
But I think the danger from that is that you end up getting, Doug Ford becomes the person who's defining what a conservative is nationally, and I just don't think that translates across the land. So like maybe that will work for the Conservative Party picking up some seats here in this province, but I just don't know how well that would play out, say, in the East Coast.
Well, that's interesting. Who is the father, because they're all men, the father of conservatism in this country? Is it Andrew Scheer? Is it Doug Ford or Jason Kenney?
Andrew Scheer would like to say it's Andrew Scheer, but I just don't know if that argument is sticking right now.
I would say the argument would be between Jason Kenney and Doug Ford. I haven't heard very many conservatives suggest or even put Andrew Scheer's name forward as being sort of the leader of the conservative movement. Now, maybe with time he'll get there, but at the moment, absolutely not.
The father of the Conservative Party, a modern Conservative Party, remains Stephen Harper. He was the one who pushed the Conservatives well over to the right. To that extent, Jason Kenney is very much Stephen Harper's heir. Doug Ford injects a level of populism into conservatism that Stephen Harper, however, would not have accepted.
Yeah. Now, will Jason Kenney accept it? I mean, how do you think Jason Kenney looks at Doug Ford's politics?
I mean, they're willing to be on a magazine cover together, so that's a start. But I still don't think, like, even with their values, I'm not sure that they're defining what modern conservatism is in this country. So far, they mostly just seem to be defining what anti-Trudeauism is, and I think that's a very different stance.
What is modern conservatism in Canada? What is it?
Somebody should tell me, because I have no idea.
Over to you, John.
Well, if you believe that Doug Ford and Jason Kenney, even though there is a difference in the populist element, reflect modern conservatism, then it is a conservatism that, once again, is anti-tax, anti-regulation, pro-business, a minimal amount of initiatives on the environment, not anti-immigrant, remains pro-immigrant in that sense. Remember, it was immigrant voters that got Doug Ford elected. But that, generally speaking, wants to see a smaller role for the state in society. And to that extent, whether you're Doug Ford or Jason Kenney or any of the other conservative premiers, you are speaking against Stephen Harper's conservatism, which was all about shrinking the size of the state and increasing initiative for individuals and for businesses.
Yeah.
John, I think you just put more bones on that skeleton than they have in the past few months.
Well, let me ask you very quickly, because we're out of time, but almost out of time. There's always a little bit more in the bank, isn't that right? But at the end of the day, did Stephen Harper really shrink the government?
The federal government, as a percentage of GDP, shrank to the levels not seen since the days of John Diefenbaker, when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. Remember, he held the line on spending after the financial crisis for a number of years, something no federal government had ever done before.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there on that note. Katie O'Malley, John Ibbotson, whose conservative credentials are back, and Elamine Abdel Mahmoud, thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kate.